The sun beat down on Dust Devil Gulch, baking the wooden buildings and turning the dirt streets into shimmering mirages. It was a town like any other in the Wild West, scratching a meager existence from the harsh land, filled with dreamers, drifters, and those just trying to survive. In a small, slightly run-down house on the edge of town lived Sarah and her father, Thomas. Sarah was a young woman with fiery red hair and eyes that could pierce steel. She was known for her quick wit and even quicker draw, a skill she'd reluctantly learned growing up in such a rough environment. But beneath her tough exterior was a heart of gold and a fierce loyalty to her father. Thomas, on the other hand, was a charismatic but deeply flawed man. He loved Sarah dearly, but he also possessed a crippling addiction to gambling. He worked as a blacksmith, a trade he was skilled at, but too often his earnings found their way into the smoky backrooms of the Golden Nugget Saloon. Sarah had pleaded with him countless times to quit, knowing his habit would eventually lead to ruin. But Thomas, blinded by the thrill of the game, always promised he would win big and provide a better life for them both. He was always chasing that elusive jackpot, convinced that his luck would eventually turn. He just needed one big win, he'd say, just one. Sarah always felt a pit in her stomach when he said. She tried to believe him, to hope that maybe this time would be different, but a small voice in her head always warned her that things were about to get much, much worse. One particularly sweltering evening, Thomas, ignoring Sarah's worried gaze, headed towards the Golden Nugget Saloon. He clutched a small pouch containing his earnings from the past few weeks, money meant for food and supplies. Sarah watched him go, a knot forming in her stomach. She knew what was coming. Inside the saloon, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of cheap whiskey. Men huddled around tables, their faces illuminated by flickering gas lamps. Thomas made his way to the back room, where the high-stakes poker game was already in full swing. He joined the table, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of hope and desperation. Around the table sat hardened gamblers, their expressions unreadable. Among them was Jed, the owner of the saloon, a man with a reputation for ruthlessness and a cold, calculating stare. Jed was an older man, heavy-set with a grizzled beard. He wore a black suit that always seemed too tight, and a gold tooth glinted when he spoke. The game began, and Thomas initially had a streak of good luck. He won a few hands, his confidence growing with each pot he claimed. Sarah would be so proud of him, he thought. Maybe this time he really would win big. But his luck soon turned. Jed, with his uncanny ability to read his opponents, began to systematically chip away at Thomas's winnings. The cards seemed to fall in Jed's favor every time. Thomas started sweating, his earlier confidence replaced by a growing sense of panic. He bet higher and higher, trying to recoup his losses, but only dug himself deeper into the hole. He just needed one good hand, one chance to turn things around. Hours passed in a blur of cards, whiskey, and mounting despair. The pile of chips in front of Jed grew larger, while Thomas's dwindled to almost nothing. Sweat dripped down his face as he desperately tried to bluff, but Jed saw through him every time. Finally, Thomas was broke. He had lost everything. His earnings, the money for supplies, even the small amount he had managed to save for Sarah's birthday. He sat there, defeated, his head in his hands. "Well, Thomas," Jed said, his voice dripping with false sympathy, "looks like you're a bit short on funds." Thomas looked up, his eyes pleading. "Please, Jed," he begged, "give me another chance. I can get the money. I promise." Jed chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "I'm not a charity, Thomas. You owe me a considerable sum. A debt must be paid." He paused, stroking his grizzled beard. "However," he continued, a glint in his eye, "I am a man of solutions." Thomas looked at him, hope flickering in his chest. "What do you mean?" Jed leaned forward, his voice a low whisper. "I hear you have a lovely daughter, Thomas. A very lovely daughter." The color drained from Thomas's face. He knew what Jed was implying. He couldn't possibly, could he? He stammered, "Sarah? You wouldn't—" Jed simply smiled, a chilling expression that sent a shiver down Thomas's spine. "Let's just say she could settle your debt and become my wife." The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. He felt sick, disgusted, and utterly ashamed. He had gambled away his daughter's future. He had put her in the hands of a monster. Thomas staggered home, his face pale and drawn. He couldn't bring himself to look Sarah in the eye. He sat at the kitchen table, his head in his hands, the weight of his actions crushing him. Sarah, sensing something was terribly wrong, rushed to his side. "Father, what is it? What happened?" He looked up at her, tears welling in his eyes. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. Finally, in a broken voice, he told her everything. He told her about the game, about losing all their money, and about Jed's horrifying proposal. Sarah listened in stunned silence, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she stood frozen, unable. Her future, her life, had been stolen from her by her own father's recklessness. The world seemed to spin around her, the small house suddenly feeling like a cage. She needed to get out. She needed to breathe. She ran out the door, leaving Thomas alone with his guilt and despair. Despite Thomas's desperate pleas for forgiveness and his hollow promises to somehow undo the deal, Jed was unmoved. The agreement was made, witnessed by the other gamblers, and, as far as Jed was concerned, it was binding. He wasted no time in making preparations for the wedding. A fancy dress, far too extravagant for Dust Devil Gulch, arrived from the near city. It was a stark white gown, adorned with lace and pearls, a symbol of purity and innocence that felt like a cruel mockery of Sarah's situation. Jed himself oversaw the preparations, transforming the Golden Nugget Saloon into a grotesque parody of a wedding venue. He even hired a traveling preacher, a shifty-eyed man who seemed more interested in Jed's money than in any higher power. Sarah, meanwhile, was trapped in a living nightmare. She was confined to her house, watched over by two of Jed's burly henchmen. She refused to speak to her father, her heart still raw with betrayal. She spent her days staring out the window, contemplating her fate. She tried to imagine running away, disappearing into the vast expanse of the Wild West, but she knew Jed would hunt her down. He was a possessive man, and he wouldn't let her escape. The townsfolk, sensing the darkness that had descended upon Dust Devil Gulch, watched in uneasy silence. Some whispered their disapproval, but fear of Jed kept them from openly protesting. They knew what he was capable of, and they didn't want to become his next target. The wedding loomed like a storm cloud, threatening to engulf the entire town. Although Sarah appeared resigned to her fate, her mind was racing. She spent hours plotting her escape, examining every corner of the house for weaknesses, every shadow for a hiding place. She knew she couldn't simply overpower the guards. They were too strong, too numerous. She needed a plan, a clever strategy that would give her a fighting chance. She considered sneaking out under the cover of darkness, grabbing her horse, and riding as far as she could. But the thought of her father stopped her cold. She knew Jed wouldn't let her escape without consequences. He would likely punish Thomas, perhaps even kill him, to make an example. The thought of her father's suffering because of her decision was unbearable. She observed the guards closely, noticing their routines, their weaknesses. They were careless, often distracted, spending more time playing cards than watching her. She also noticed that Thomas, despite his shame and guilt, was allowed to move freely around town, likely to keep up appearances and prevent suspicion. This gave her an idea. One morning, while the guards were occupied with their card game, Sarah managed to slip a note to a young boy who often ran errands for the town. She asked him to deliver it to a trusted friend, a woman named Martha, who owned the general store. In the note, she explained her situation and asked for Martha's help. She knew it was a risk, but she had to try something. Her escape plan was forming, but it was more complicated now, intricately tied to her father's safety. Days turned into a slow, agonizing crawl towards the inevitable wedding. Martha, the store owner, subtly aided Sarah by passing along information through the young errand boy. She learned about Jed's dealings in town, the way he squeezed money from the vulnerable, how he cheated honest workers, and how he used fear to control everyone. Each story fueled Sarah's anger and strengthened her resolve. She heard tales of families forced to leave town because they couldn't pay Jed's exorbitant rents, of farmers losing their land due to rigged deals, and of saloon girls being mistreated and exploited. Jed was a parasite, sucking the lifeblood out of Dust Devil Gulch, and no one dared to stand up to him. One particular story struck a chord with Sarah. It was about a young man who had tried to organize a protest against Jed's unfair practices. He was found beaten and left for dead on the outskirts of town, a stark warning to anyone else who dared to challenge Jed's authority. Hearing these stories, Sarah realized that her situation was not unique. She was just another victim of Jed's cruelty, but she was in a position to do something about it. Her initial plan of escape began to morph into something more, something bigger than just saving herself. She realized she had a responsibility to protect her father, but also to protect the town from Jed's tyranny. Her fear began to be replaced by a burning sense of purpose. She would not be a victim. She would be a force for change. The wedding day dawned, casting a long shadow over Dust Devil Gulch. The Golden Nugget Saloon was packed with townsfolk, a grim audience witnessing a forced union. Jed, dressed in a new black suit, stood at the makeshift altar, his gold tooth gleaming as he surveyed the crowd with a smug satisfaction. Sarah was led into the saloon by the two henchmen, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a quiet defiance. She wore the white gown, but it felt like a shroud. Her steps were slow and deliberate, each one a silent act of rebellion. Her father, Thomas, stood in the corner, his face etched with guilt and despair. He tried to catch her eye, but she refused to acknowledge him. As she walked down the aisle, she noticed the faces in the crowd. Some looked away, unable to bear the sight of her humiliation. Others offered her fleeting glances of sympathy. But she also saw a glimmer of hope in some eyes, a silent encouragement that gave her strength. The preacher began the ceremony, his voice droning on about love and commitment, words that rang hollow in the tense atmosphere. Sarah listened with growing impatience, her hand subtly reaching inside her dress, clutching the small Derringer Martha had managed to sneak to her. The plan was in motion. The moment was near. She just had to wait for the right opportunity. The forced smile plastered on her face hit a heart filled with a potent mixture of fear and determination. She would not let Jed win. The preacher reached the pivotal moment of the ceremony. If anyone has any reason why these two should not be joined in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. A hush fell over the saloon. Jed smirked, confident that no one would dare to interrupt. But then Sarah moved. With a swift, practiced motion, she reached inside her dress and pulled out the Derringer. The small pistol glinted in the dim light, silencing the preacher mid-sentence. All eyes turned to Sarah, their faces a mixture of shock and disbelief. "I have a reason," Sarah said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the silence. She pointed the Derringer directly at Jed. "This man is a liar, a cheat, and a thief. He has terrorized this town for too long, and I will not become another one of his victims." Jed's smug expression vanished, replaced by a look of stunned fury. "Sarah, what are you doing?" he growled, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun at his side. "I'm taking back my life," she replied, her grip on the Derringer tightening. "And I'm taking back this town." The saloon erupted in chaos. Some people screamed, others dove for cover. The two henchmen moved to protect Jed, but Sarah was too quick. She kept the gun trained on Jed, her eyes blazing with righteous anger. The wedding dress suddenly didn't seem so white anymore. It was a symbol of her fight, her rebellion against the darkness that had consumed Dust Devil Gulch. The ceremony was over. The confrontation had begun. A tense standoff settled over the saloon. The music stopped, the chatter ceased, and all eyes were glued to Sarah and Jed. The two henchmen, momentarily stunned by Sarah's audacity, hesitated to make a move, unsure of Jed's orders. "You think you could just waltz in here and threaten me?" Jed snarled, his face reddening with rage. "You're nothing but a spoiled little girl." "I'm more than you think," Sarah retorted, her voice unwavering. "I know about the families you've ruined, the land you've stolen, the people you've hurt. You've built your empire on the backs of honest, hard-working folks, and I'm here to put an end to it." She continued, her voice growing louder, addressing the entire room. How many of you have suffered because of this man? How many of you have been cheated, threatened, or forced to live in fear? He preys on the weak, but he's nothing but a coward. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shifted nervously, while others exchanged glances of agreement. Sarah's words were striking a chord, igniting a spark of defiance that had long been suppressed. "Don't listen to her lies," Jed roared, trying to regain control of the situation. "She's just trying to stir up trouble. I've always looked out for this town." But his words rang hollow. The townsfolk had seen his cruelty firsthand. They knew the truth. Sarah's courage was giving them the strength to finally acknowledge it. The derringer in her hand was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of hope, a promise of change. Jed, realizing he was losing control, lunged forward, his hand reaching for his own gun. It was a desperate move, but he knew he had to silence Sarah before she incited a full-blown rebellion. But Sarah was faster. In a swift, decisive motion, she pulled the trigger. The derringer roared, the sound echoing through the stunned silence of the saloon. Jed staggered backward, clutching his chest, a look of disbelief on his face. A crimson stain spread rapidly across his black suit. He gasped, struggling to speak. You can't." Before he could finish his sentence, he collapsed to the floor, his body hitting the wooden planks with a thud. The gold tooth in his mouth glinted one last time before he lay still. A collective gasp swept through the saloon. The townsfolk stared in stunned silence, their eyes fixed on Jed's lifeless body. Sarah stood frozen, the derringer still clutched in her hand, her chest heaving. The act was done. She had shot Jed. A wave of conflicting emotions washed over her. Relief, fear, and a profound sense of uncertainty. She had freed herself from his grasp, and perhaps freed the town from his tyranny, but she had also committed a crime. She had taken a life. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear: Dust Devil Gulch would never be the same. The silence was broken by a slow clap, coming from the back of the saloon. Martha, the store owner, stepped forward, her eyes filled with admiration. Then another clap, and another, until the entire saloon erupted in applause. Sarah had done what no one else had dared to do. She had stood up to Jed, and she had won. The applause continued, but Sarah barely heard it. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins began to subside, replaced by a chilling wave of fear. She had killed a man, and regardless of his crimes, that was a heavy burden to bear. She looked down at the derringer in her hand, the small weapon suddenly feeling immense, a symbol of the irreversible act she had committed. Doubts began to creep into her mind. Had she done the right thing? Would the town truly be better off without Jed, or would his absence create a power vacuum, leading to even more chaos and violence? She glanced at her father, Thomas, who stood frozen in the corner, his face a mask of shock and grief. She knew she had acted to protect him, but she also knew that her actions would have profound consequences for him as well. Would he be able to live with the guilt of knowing that his gambling addiction had led to this? The reality of her situation began to sink in. The future that had seemed so bleak just moments ago now seemed even more uncertain, filled with danger and uncertainty. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, threatening to crush her spirit. She longed for the simple life she had once known, before the gambling debts, before Jed's proposal, before the wedding that never was. But that life was gone forever. She had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The initial shock began to wear off, and the townsfolk of Dust Devil Gulch started to react in different ways. Some, emboldened by Sarah's actions, openly celebrated Jed's demise. They saw her as a hero, a savior who had finally freed them from his oppressive rule. They gathered around her, offering words of support and gratitude. "You did what had to be done, Sarah," Martha said, her voice filled with emotion. "You saved us all." Others, however, remained cautious, their faces etched with fear. They knew that Jed's death would not go unanswered. He had a gang of loyal followers who would likely seek revenge. They worried about the consequences, about the violence that might erupt in the town. "This is just the beginning," whispered an old farmer, shaking his head. "They'll come looking for her, and they won't be happy. A few even expressed outright disapproval, clinging to the belief that Sarah had committed a terrible crime. They feared the law, the chaos, and the disruption to their lives. They believed in order, even if that order was imposed by a tyrant. Thomas, finally breaking free from his stunned stupor, pushed his way through the crowd and reached Sarah. His eyes were filled with a mixture of guilt, remorse, and a newfound respect. He reached out to her, his hand trembling. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse, "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen." Sarah looked at him, her expression unreadable. She knew he was sincere, but the pain of his betrayal was still fresh. The town was divided, and Sarah was caught in the middle, uncertain of what the future held. The applause had faded, replaced by a palpable sense of unease. The uneasy calm was shattered by the sound of an approaching horse. Dust Devil Gulch had a sheriff, a man named Caleb, but he rarely interfered with Jed's affairs, either out of fear or complicity. This rider, however, was different. He wore a sheriff's badge, but his eyes held a weariness that spoke of long journeys and difficult decisions. Sheriff Brody dismounted in front of the Golden Nugget, his gaze sweeping over the scene before him. The stunned townsfolk, the blood-stained wedding dress, and Jed's lifeless body. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face and a quiet demeanor. He wasn't from Dust Devil Gulch, but he had heard rumors about Jed's activities and had been riding to investigate. He hadn't expected to arrive in the aftermath of a shooting. He approached Sarah, his expression unreadable. "I'm Sheriff Brody," he said, his voice calm but firm. "What happened here?" Sarah hesitated, unsure of whether to trust him. She looked around at the townsfolk, seeking their support. Martha stepped forward, her eyes pleading with the sheriff. "She did what she had to do, Sheriff," Martha said, her voice trembling slightly. "Jed was a bad man. He was hurting everyone in this town." Sheriff Brody listened intently, his gaze shifting between Sarah and the crowd. He could see the fear in their eyes, but he also saw a glimmer of hope, a sense of liberation. He knew that the story wasn't just about Sarah anymore. It was about justice, morality, and the struggle for survival in the Wild West. Sheriff Brody, determined to uncover the truth, began his investigation. He started by questioning the townsfolk, carefully listening to their stories of Jed's cruelty and exploitation. He learned about the rigged poker games, the exorbitant rents, and the strong-arm tactics Jed used to control Dust Devil Gulch. He searched Jed's office in the Golden Nugget, finding ledgers filled with evidence of illegal activities, shady land deals, falsified loan documents, and records of payments to corrupt officials. He discovered hidden compartments containing weapons, cash, and incriminating letters. The evidence painted a clear picture of Jed as a ruthless tyrant who had abused his power for personal gain. He spoke with Thomas, who, consumed by guilt and remorse, confessed everything about his gambling addiction and the horrifying deal he had made with Jed. Thomas's testimony further solidified the case against Jed, revealing the depths of his depravity. Sheriff Brody also interviewed Sarah, listening patiently as she recounted her ordeal, her voice trembling with emotion. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw the strength and determination that had driven her to take such drastic action. He believed her story. He believed that she had acted in self-defense, not only to save herself but also to protect the town. The more he investigated, the more convinced Sheriff Brody became that Sarah had been justified in her actions. He was still bound by the law, but he also recognized that there were times when justice demanded more than just a strict adherence to the rules. He had a difficult decision to make, one that would determine not only Sarah's fate, but also the future of Dust Devil Gulch. Sheriff Brody, after careful consideration, approached Sarah with a proposition. He could let her escape, give her a head start, and pretend he hadn't seen her. It would be the easiest solution, but it wouldn't be justice. Sarah listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. Escape was tempting, but she knew it wouldn't solve anything. Jed's gang would still be out there, and the town would still be vulnerable. She also couldn't run from her conscience. She had to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how daunting they might be. "Thank you, Sheriff," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. but I can't run. I have to stand trial." Sheriff Brody nodded, a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "It won't be easy," he warned. "The law is the law, and you killed a man." "I know," Sarah replied, "but I believe I can prove that I acted in self-defense. And I have to do it for my father, for the town, for everyone who has suffered under Jed's rule." She knew it was a gamble. The outcome of the trial was uncertain, and she could face severe punishment. But she also knew that it was the right thing to do. She had to fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone in Dust Devil Gulch. With Sheriff Brody's support, Sarah began to prepare for the trial. She knew she needed to gather evidence, find witnesses, and convince the jury that she had acted in self-defense. It would be a long and difficult battle, but she was ready to fight for her freedom and for the future of her town. Her decision to stand trial transformed her from a desperate fugitive into a symbol of hope and resilience. The whole town watched and waited, knowing that the fate of Dust Devil Gulch rested on her shoulders. As Sarah prepared for the trial, memories flooded her mind, painting a vivid picture of Jed's villainy and her own growing determination to resist him. These flashbacks offered a deeper understanding of the events that had led her to the wedding day. She remembered witnessing Jed evicting a widow and her children from their home because they couldn't afford the rent. She had been just a young girl then, but the sight of the woman's despair had stayed with her. Jed had shown no mercy, his eyes cold and devoid of emotion. She recalled another incident, years later, when Jed had cheated her father out of a valuable piece of land. Thomas had been desperate for money, and Jed had taken advantage of his vulnerability, offering him a loan with impossible terms. When Thomas couldn't repay the loan, Jed had seized the land, leaving her father heartbroken and humiliated. These experiences, and many others like them, had shaped Sarah's perception of Jed. She saw him as a symbol of injustice, a force of darkness that had to be stopped. As she grew older, she became more and more determined to stand up to him, to protect her father and the town from his cruelty. The flashbacks also revealed Sarah's growing friendship with Martha, the store owner. Martha had been a source of support and guidance, encouraging Sarah to resist Jed's influence and to fight for what was right. It was Martha who had taught her how to shoot, how to defend herself, and how to stand up for her beliefs. Their bond was strong, forged in the face of adversity. These memories fueled Sarah's resolve to fight for justice, to prove that she had acted in self-defense, and to protect her town from further tyranny. They were a reminder of everything she was fighting for, and they gave her the strength to face the difficult days ahead. The trial began, drawing crowds from all over the territory. The small courthouse in Dust Devil Gulch was packed, the atmosphere thick with anticipation. Sarah, dressed in a simple but respectable dress, sat at the defendant's table, her gaze steady and unwavering. The prosecution presented their case, arguing that Sarah had acted out of malice and had taken the law into her own hands. They painted Jed as a respected businessman, a pillar of the community, and portrayed Sarah as a cold-blooded killer. But as the trial progressed, Sarah's courage began to inspire others to come forward and testify against Jed. Martha was the first to take the stand, recounting Jed's cruelty and exploitation of the town. She spoke with passion and conviction, her words resonating with the jury. Then, one by one, other townsfolk came forward, sharing their stories of Jed's villainy. They spoke of the families he had ruined, the land he had stolen. Their testimonies shattered the prosecution's portrayal of Jed as a respected businessman, revealing him to be a ruthless tyrant who had terrorized the town for years. Sarah's courage had given them the strength to finally speak the truth, to break free from the fear that had held them captive for so long. The trial was transforming into a reckoning, a moment of catharsis for the entire town. The most powerful testimony of all came from Thomas, Sarah's father. He took the stand, his face etched with remorse and shame. He confessed to his gambling addiction, admitting that it was his recklessness that had led to the horrifying deal with Jed. He spoke of his love for Sarah, his desire to provide a better life for her, and his utter devastation when he realized the consequences of his actions. He described Jed's cruelty, his manipulation, and his complete disregard for human life. "I failed her," Thomas said, his voice breaking with emotion. "I put her in danger, and I almost cost her everything. But she is the strongest, bravest person I know. She did what I couldn't do. She stood up to Jed, and she saved this town." He looked at Sarah, his eyes filled with tears. "I'm so proud of you, Sarah. You're a true hero." His testimony had a profound impact on the jury. They saw the genuine remorse in his eyes, the depth of his love for his daughter, and the sincerity of his praise for her bravery. It was a turning point in the trial, shifting the focus from Sarah's actions to the circumstances that had led her to take such drastic measures. Thomas's willingness to admit his mistakes and to praise his daughter's courage solidified Sarah's defense and gave the jury a compelling reason to believe in her innocence. His testimony was a testament to the power of love, redemption, and the enduring bond between a father and daughter. After days of testimony and impassioned arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The fate of Sarah and the future of Dust Devil Gulch rested in their hands. The townsfolk waited anxiously outside the courthouse, their hopes and fears hanging in the balance. Inside the jury room, the 12 jurors wrestled with the evidence, the law, and their consciences. They debated the circumstances of the shooting, the extent of Jed's crimes, and the moral implications of Sarah's actions. Some argued that she had violated the law and deserved to be punished. Others maintained that she had acted in self-defense and had saved the town from a tyrant. They weighed the cold, hard facts against the collective experience of Dust Devil Gulch, the years of suffering and oppression under Jed's rule. They considered the courage of the witnesses who had come forward, the remorse of Thomas, and the unwavering strength of Sarah herself. The deliberations stretched on for hours, the tension in the jury room growing with each passing moment. Some jurors were swayed by the law, others by their emotions. They debated and argued, trying to reach a consensus that would be both just and fair. The decision was not easy, but they knew that it was their responsibility to weigh the evidence, consider the circumstances, and render a verdict that would reflect the values of their community. They needed to decide if the law was blind or if it could see the situation for what it truly was. In the end, they had to decide if Sarah was a criminal or a hero. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the jury reached a verdict. The news spread quickly through Dust Devil Gulch, and the townsfolk gathered outside the courthouse, their faces a mixture of hope and apprehension. Sheriff Brody emerged from the courthouse, his expression grave. He stepped onto the porch, silencing the murmuring crowd with a raised hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice echoing through the town square, "the jury has reached a verdict." Sarah, her heart pounding in her chest, was led into the courtroom. She stood before the judge, her gaze fixed on the jury. The foreman, a weathered farmer who had lost his land to Jed, rose to his feet. "In the case of the people versus Sarah," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "we the jury find the defendant." He paused, the silence in the courtroom deafening. Sarah held her breath, bracing herself for the worst. The fate of her town, her father, and herself hung in the balance. Would the jury find her guilty, condemning her to a life of imprisonment, or would they recognize the justice of her actions and set her free? "Not guilty." A collective gasp swept through the courtroom, followed by an eruption of cheers and applause. Sarah's eyes welled up with tears of relief and gratitude. She had been vindicated. The jury had recognized that she had acted in self-defense and had saved the town from tyrant. The future of Dust Devil Gulch was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Sarah had given them a chance to rebuild, to create a better world for themselves. She had killed her owner, but in doing so, she had freed her town. The end.